Welcome back. You're watching the Carbon Trust Route to Net Zero Africa event, and green finance is the subject of our next panel titled Financing an Equitable Accelerated Climate Transition. This panel is live, so if you'd like to ask a question, please put it into the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of this video window, and we'll put those through towards the end of the session to the panel members in the studio. Christel van Vuren is here to moderate the panel. Christel is an associate director with the Carbon Trust in Africa, and she focuses on the delivery of key projects, including science-based targets, which we heard a little about earlier, and helps both the private and public sectors quantify the carbon offsets of products and services. Christel, welcome, and over to you.
Ralph, thanks ever so much, and I'm really excited to be here. So net zero by 2050 will only be feasible with a really ambitious and comprehensive approach from all actors. And that includes intrinsically and critically the financial sector that must play this pivotal role to deliver decarbonisation of sectors at the pace required by mobilising the capital to do this. Now, we've heard earlier during this day already from the other sessions before about companies setting ambitious targets, practical considerations for getting there, the progress made, as well as Africa's vast potential, which is why an event called Net Zero Africa would have been incomplete without a focus on the financing to make that a reality, especially the equitable accelerated part of it. In working to achieve this, there's going to be some brutal truths, and necessarily we'll have to face those as well as numerous other obstacles. But being intentional in directing capital flows and monitoring the impacts and being transparent on progress is going to be necessary. But so is vision, innovation, and courage. So doing something differently and making bold moves is what we really need the finance sector to be doing to make the real change in the economy that we need. So I'm exceptionally excited to have the privilege to moderate our panel today of the movers and shakers who are working to upscale green and transition finance across the spectrum of the sector, who will share their own insights and practical advice. Now, I'm joined by the following panelists, very kindly joining to bring their views. We've got Shamila Subramuni from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, who is Chief Sustainability Officer there. Welcome, Shamila. We have Robin Grenfell, Senior Manager from Macquarie Green Investment Group. Thomas Teichesen, who is Head of Strategy at SEB Merchant Banking. Nigel Beck, Head of Sustainable Finance and ESG at Rand Merchant Bank. As well as Amelie Min, Director of Climate Change at CDC Group. Welcome, everybody. It's really fantastic for us to have such an illustrious group together, and so many of you, as I said, working from different places in the world and different ways of interacting with the economy. Now, I'm not going to steal anyone's thunder because what I'd like to do is to actually have the chance at this juncture to hand straight across to our panelists to start hearing from them. And I'm going to launch directly in with my first question to Shamila, and then we'll go around the room to ask you, what is your organization's focus and most significant activities at the moment to support the decarbonisation in the real economy and upscale green and transition finance in emerging markets in particular? Shamila, over to you.
Thank you, Christel, and good day to everybody watching us. Lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Christel, the role of the exchange is fairly unique. And so let me first position that for you. It sits at the juncture between those who are seeking capital and those who have capital to give. Predominantly, the exchange is a platform for the trading of financial instruments. Now, it has, in our case, predominantly three phases. There's the regulator, because there's a frontline regulatory arm that the JSE plays. And of course, if you're an issuer or listed company on the JSE, you will know that that's the division that looks at the rules and regulations that sustain your listing. And then there's the platform where we trade these instruments. And of course, there's the JSE Limited, which is a corporate like any others. So our approach to this is not purely just on green. So let me contextualize. Our focus is broadly on sustainability. And of course, the green elements are a massive part of that, particularly as we're looking at the transition to green to enable, our climate change objectives and the like. So what we really want to do as an exchange in terms of our approach to sustainability broadly is to support the creation of an enabling environment for better sustainability practices and disclosure to grow. And it's very important when I explain to you just now why we talk about that broader-based approach. So if we want to create this enabling environment for better disclosure practices and also business practices to grow premised on good governance, it then makes it easier to understand where we focus. So we know that for sustainability, that's our focus. When it comes to the green elements in particular, we see that playing out predominantly through two areas. The first one is in the instruments that we enable. So how do we create a platform for the listing and trading of elements or of instruments or that allow for assets, for the financing of assets that can be tagged as green? And there we have our sustainability segment as the JSE. So there's a specific segment where you can come and raise social bonds, green bonds, and sustainability bonds, where you need to use the use of proceeds model. So you need to decide what activities or assets you're going to be financing, and then the money then needs to be ring fenced, and you need to report annually on how you're actually using the proceeds that you're coming to market to raise. So there are very specific criteria for your issuance to be tagged as a green bond, a social bond, or a sustainability bond. Green is obviously the easier one. We've seen green bonds grow globally. And so what does that mean in our context? So we create that platform. There's regulation around it, which means that then the market has a level of confidence about the credibility, hopefully, around those instruments and their checks and balances. And there's a regulator that sits behind that to some extent. So that is where we help the market. We help the market in looking at credibility, creating the platform to trade. And as at just recently, I think we topped the $1 billion mark in terms of issuances on that sustainability segment in the JSE, which is very exciting. And of course, that was the first instruments to be listed were green bonds, and then we expanded to the others. So that is one of the elements. And then the second one is on transparency. So how else do we create an enabling environment? The second one is transparency and disclosure. And so when we talk about that, the JSE has long been considered a market where integrated reporting is mandatory, but that is as a consequence of the King Codes of Corporate Governance being incorporated in our listings requirements. So if you're listed on the JSE, you're required to report in line with the King Codes of Corporate Governance, and King is very explicit about the need to consider people, planet, profit, or your environmental, social governance issues, and that it is and to do those in a way that has considered materiality, so that you've applied your mind as a governing body, as a management team, to what are the material issues in that spectrum, and how are you starting to consider that in your business. And of course, there's a risk element, there's an opportunity element, there's an element of how does it impact you as a business, and how do you as a business impact those issues, looking outward as well. So once you start applying your mind to that and disclosing that, that then has the additional element of business certainty. Well, actually, okay, in this context, green really matters. This is what I need to start enabling, or what I need to start disenabling in relation to my business model, and considering that using a materiality lens. So that is very briefly the two particular areas that we do. And then we play quite a strong role in advocacy and engagement at a national and a global level in being able to try to bring that agenda closer home, being able to make sure that our market understands some of this, that we're guiding our issues appropriately. And in fact, tomorrow we go live with the public disclosure version, public consultation version of our sustainability guidance, sustainability disclosure guidance, and our climate change disclosure guidance. So completely relevant to looking at all aspects green and how to transition to a greener economy. I think in particular, the climate change disclosure guidance is going to help with helping our issuers in being able to consider these matters. Thanks, Christelle.
Fantastic, Shamila. Thank you so much. And that actually gives us a fantastic segue to hear from our next speaker, Robin.
Thank you, Christelle. And yes, great to be here. So I work for the Green Investment Group, which is part of Macquarie Group. And GIG has been investing solely in green infrastructure since it was set up in 2013 by the UK government. And since it was acquired by Macquarie Group in 2017, we've continued that mandate of investing only in green infrastructure. But we've also now got a global remit. So we've been investing in earlier and earlier stage development, actually, of renewable energy projects and other green infrastructure. And actually just recently, just last month, in fact, we announced that we'll be moving into Macquarie Asset Management and now setting up GIG labelled funds. So giving us access to institutional capital and really giving us the platform to grow at scale and actually give more investors opportunity to invest in earlier stage development projects, which is certainly a demand we are hearing, which is crucial because the scale of the challenge is clear. There's a huge amount of investment needed in sustainable infrastructure, and we're really excited to be at the forefront of that. So that's just some activity in terms of the Green Investment Group. We've also, within the asset management field, we've set up some innovative financial mechanisms, such as UK Climate Investments, UKCI, which is a joint venture with the UK government. And that the UKCI is there to help emerging economies invest in really tackle climate change and promote clean and resilient and inclusive growth. So just yesterday, actually, we announced an increased investment into Rovigo Africa Energy Limited, which is a yieldco dedicated to investing in operational renewable energy projects in South Africa. I was really excited about that platform. That new funding of £15 million or 315 million rand, that accompanies the initial commitment of 500 million rand made 2 years ago. So very excited to see how we can deploy capital in that space using some innovative platforms that's really been designed from our experience from GIB's, Green Investment Bank's experience of setting up these types of investments, really, and crucially establishing partnerships. We see that as a crucial enabler to delivering the required sustainable infrastructure across the globe, recognizing the local context and the particular pressures on the local jurisdictions and the requirement to build partnerships to deliver the required investment at scale. One other area I wanted to call out in terms of our involvement, GIG's involvement and Macquarie more broadly, is in various industry initiatives, looking at potential market failures in terms of what's inhibiting the growth of sustainable infrastructure, and specifically what's inhibiting the crowding in of private investment. And one such initiative is FAST Infra. FAST stands for Financing to Accelerate the Sustainable Transition. And I was involved in a working group along with colleagues from the Global Infrastructure Facility and HSBC to establish a sustainable infrastructure label. And that label is there to provide coherency to all market participants, all financiers and developers, as to what constitutes sustainable infrastructure. And so that was an exhaustive exercise, really hugely collaborative across the spectrum of public, private finances, experts in sustainability, ratings agencies, etc. And this is now live, this SI label. And to Shamila's point about the need for transparency and disclosure, that's a key tenet of this label, where we want asset owners and developers to disclose and promote the sustainability credentials of their infrastructure assets. And we believe this can really help align interests, so attract investment, facilitate due diligence, and actually increase the speed of transactions, which again is crucially important as we address the significant sustainable investment gap. So we hope that this could be globally applicable and really beneficial to attracting investment, in particular in emerging economies. So that's my intro, and like I said, great to be here and part of this panel.
Ever so much thanks, Robin. That's we're very much aware of the FAST Infra label, and I think that's really exciting that that's moving into the emerging market space with its challenges nonetheless, and we'll hear from you a little bit later about what those might be. From there, I'll hand across to Thomas. I'm sure you've got some brutal truth to share with us too. Go ahead, Thomas.
Absolutely. Well, I'm thrilled to be here, and I should just mention I'm calling in from the other side of the world, sitting in Scandinavia and working for a Swedish bank. So we have a slightly different perspective, perhaps. So if you ask us, say, what are we doing to speed this up? I think the answer is pretty much everything we can, because our bank has just announced that everything from our credit policy to our investment management framework will be aligned with the need to be transitioning everything we do within the next 30 years. Now, the reason for that, if you just want to give some background, it's not just that we would like to see a better world. My bank has been owned by the same family for 165 years, and it is in our DNA to help companies when new technologies emerge to come out on the other side stronger when the new world actually is there. And this is, you could say, the fifth technology cycle we're in. So what the message we got from our owners was, if the bank is to be relevant 10 years from now, the bank will need to be changed completely at that point in time, and that process is just starting now. But it's also because, of course, we have ambitions to do things better. And from that perspective, well, the credentials we have at SEB is that we helped co-invent the green bond back in 2007, 2008, together with the World Bank, anchoring that with a group of Swedish pension funds. And since then, we've been working hard to find out how we can channel capital in the right direction. I think the last 2 years, things have changed. In the first decade of green financing, it was all about providing or raising awareness. We actually had to work hard to persuade a lot of people in the corporate sector as well that there was a problem. You don't need to do that anymore. Everybody is on board. And it's not about raising awareness now, it's about raising capital. The real business of transition has started. And unfortunately, the business of transition is dirty, it's expensive, and it's super risky. The dreams we might have had in the financial sector until recently that you could do the magic bullet trick and have one portfolio that would make the world better and make fantastic returns and make you look good in the media, I don't think that's going to happen. A pragmatic approach of raising capital also means engaging with the parts of the economy that are investing in future emission reductions, but today can't actually do it because the technologies do not exist or are not developed enough. So that's the main emphasis I think we're shifting towards now. The need to build the infrastructure, that's where you typically find governments will be involved and maybe facilitating the channeling of capital. But in the private sector, we think that there is a huge and uncovered need for capital. Our assessment is that in total, transition will require $4,000 billion annually, more than what we're currently spending. At least 1 to 1,500 billion of that will come from the corporate sector, the companies that today use fossil fuel and that need to change their technology and replace their capital stock. That's where I think the uncovered capital need is. And we're, of course, working hard to see if we can find out new and innovative ways to make sure that the capital actually ends up where it really makes a difference in terms of changing the emission level in the future. So I hope that gave you a little bit of an idea about why I'm here and also some maybe slightly different perspective compared with what you've heard before. But it's time to be realistic, I think, now.
Thomas, very much appreciated. And yes, quite right. I mean, Nigel, I'd love to hear about your perspectives on realism and capital flows in South Africa.
Sure. Thanks, Christelle, and good to be here as well. So I think where we are, and obviously FirstRand's one of Africa's largest banks. We've got a net zero commitment. It's a commitment that we've recently made through our kind of TCFD report. But in addition to that, what we have done is we've made a commitment to around 200 billion rands worth of facilitation of transitional finance kind of over the next 5 years. So when we talk about transitional finance facilitation, we talk beyond just extending balance sheet. We talk about raising bonds. We talk about syndications. We talk about advisory services as well. And we've got a very strong focus on green, supporting the climate action, the deployment of kind of cleaner energy sources, activities, renewable energy efficiency, green buildings, circular economy. But I think also importantly, what we are looking at is kind of the social element, the just element. How do we advance socio-economic inclusion, support education, healthcare, community finance and the like. I think one of the key aspects of what we've done within RMB is we've built out a senior team. And the senior team essentially has kind of the sole mandate for sustainable finance and ESG advisory. The idea is to try and build an ecosystem of products and services that support decarbonisation of our clients, essentially, in the African continent. So we've built out a number of different types of products aligned to companies' journeys, very much aligned to what some of the previous speakers have said. There's essentially not one size fits all. There's not one product. You need to look along kind of a sequence of different products as part of kind of the sustainable ecosystem. And this is supporting clients in their journey. So looking at kind of the likes of short-term facilities, green deposits, green bonds and loans, sustainability-linked loans and bonds, etc. and even going beyond that as well, looking at kind of transitional finance advisory services. So there's obviously an important place and a role that we can play in working with our key clients around how do we support them in that transition, not only by extending balance sheet, but also providing them advisory services around what transitional finance instruments are available. Now, I think we've had a number of successes in this space over the last few months. We've closed a couple of iconic deals, such as, for example, Equitas Green Loan, which was one of these kind of IFC Edge certified green buildings with essentially 20% more energy efficiency, embodied energy and water. We also recently closed the Mediclinic Sustainability linked loan, which was on a syndicated basis, very much aligned to Mediclinic's target around being net zero, essentially carbon neutral by 2030, as well as kind of their zero waste target. So what we did is we worked very much in line with them trying to achieve those targets. And similarly, also working with some of our state-owned companies like Rand Water, working on their sustainability-linked bond, working with them trying to understand access to kind of potable water, installation of renewable energy, gender equality. And I know a lot of this goes beyond the specific climate debate, but I think one thing that is important is we do need to bring in kind of that social just element. So I think with regards to what we're playing in the African continent, it's very much a beginning of the journey, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to enable our clients and work with them as they go on this transition journey, and we go on this transition journey with them too.
Nigel, thanks ever so much. That actually sets us off in a great way. Again, a segue for Amin to come in to tell us about the great work that the CDC group is also doing in a slightly upstream sense, but very much interconnected.
Thank you. Yes, and a lot of what's been said, fully agreeing with and nodding, and it resonates very much with how we are approaching this agenda. So we have set ourselves a Paris alignment agenda, and we've within that context have three main building blocks. The first one to be net zero by 2050 at the portfolio level. The second is to invest in a way that can intentionally support a just transition, particularly for workers and communities that may be possibly negatively impacted by the transition if not managed, and very much as the point that Nigel was just saying about the social dimension, and then also the importance for investing more in adaptation and resilience. So as the UK's development finance institution and impact investor, we primarily invest in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. We will be South Asia. We're going to be also investing in Southeast Asia, and potentially also in the Caribbean, actually, from our next 5-year strategy, which begins 1st of January. So for us, looking and investing in a way that delivers very strong development impact is critical. And I think when we, as we look at this net zero agenda, particularly when you look at what happened in Glasgow, where there was, we heard around of these 130 trillion of assets under management that are increasingly going to be looking for net zero compliant assets. And, the key challenge that we face, and for us as a development finance institution, is how do we ensure we get that capital to where it's most needed, particularly for development. And we know particularly infrastructure needs in emerging markets are huge, and the bulk of what is really needed in terms of thinking about the infrastructure investment moving forward. So it's really critical that we work with others. We know we can't, as a DFI, we have to partner with others, whether that's with banks such as RMB in South Africa, whether that's with corporates, whether that's with investors increasingly that are looking to become net zero aligned, that we need to support this transition, this economic transition, social transition, and of course the net zero transition. And so when we look at our net zero approach, and we're actually now just in the process of finalizing our plan for how we will get to net zero, which is a pathway to by 2050 to be net zero, but then looking at, well, what does that mean for our next 5-year strategy period? So, as of next year, we'll be taking that portfolio level approach. However, we also think it's important to look at each individual investment. And so we're also, for each investment, would assess the extent to which that is Paris aligned. Now, that's quite challenging in some sectors because we know, particularly when you look at these sort of global models and sort of pathways for net zero, that, they are global. The data is very aggregated and it doesn't necessarily take into account the different development needs of countries, and particularly those countries that still need to significantly increase energy consumption. And, how do we understand what that means for a country, that really, particularly many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa that really still need a lot more investment in the electricity sector. But this is something we're working with colleagues particularly in our DFI, European DFI colleagues, with others to come up with a common approach towards this. And, I'm very much now looking to ensure that each investment we make will be consistent then with net zero. So maybe I'll stop there and, happy to answer more questions.
Fantastic. Thanks ever so much. So in my next question, and I'd love to, you've already started to touch on challenges. Some of you have just glanced at them. I've also heard the words infrastructure several times, ecosystem, partners, and innovation, as well as financing and plans, targets, and strategies. So this all talks to me to some extent about progress made, sights set, and a road forward, but with obstacles ahead. I'm certain. So perhaps we'll go in the opposite order, just to make things exciting. Amelie, from your perspective, if you had a sort of a word or a phrase that's top of your mind for the biggest challenge that's facing the CDC group in actually upscaling its activities or rolling out its intentions, what would that be? And if you could do sort of magic wand that, what would you want to wave and wish?
Yes, so I think I would say when you look at the commitment to stay within 1.5 degrees, which was really what Glasgow COP26 has confirmed, the urgency and the imperative to stay within 1.5 degrees. We know that requires significant reduction of emissions globally by 2030. We know that if we overshoot too much by 2030, then we won't be able to stay within that temperature goal. And what that really means is huge capital investment in the next 5 to 10 years, because we also know that most of the investments that are needed are very capital intensive, so renewables and also more investment in resource productivity. And, and that is a huge financing challenge, but also a huge opportunity. I think the one area that I worry about, if you like, it keeps me up at night, is, how do we really ensure that we can meet the scale at the pace that is needed in the absence of, really strong concerted effort to build out those infrastructure assets, in particular, build out the pipeline, because I feel that there's increasingly a lot of supply of finance looking for these types of investments, but maybe not as much demand in the form of those sustainable infrastructure assets that are coming forward at the pace that will be needed.
Thanks so much. Nigel?
Yes, well, if I look at the challenges from an R&B perspective, one of the key challenges I would suggest is almost a skills challenge. So I think there's not a lot of relevant product experience and skills experience specifically in the African environment. There's a handful of individuals that have that skill set. So that's something that would probably need to be worked on. In addition to that, and if we look beyond our borders, if we look beyond the South African borders, I think there's a knowledge gap and a lack of awareness around what sustainable finance really means beyond South Africa into the African continent. So often when we deal in conversations with colleagues of mine or clients on the continent, people often see sustainable finance, climate finance as some type of peripheral activity. So in other words, it's something that's very much akin to impact investing. There's a limited pool of investors that would be looking at that. They're actually unaware that it's mainstream. And then I think beyond that as well, if we look at where people's expectations are. So there's an expectation that with regards to climate finance, it's cheap finance, but quite often it carries an additional risk. So it's trying to balance that kind of risk-return conundrum. You're essentially looking at high-risk technologies without a track record, but corporates and people are wanting lower pricing to get traction in the market. So for me, those are the three things that I think, and some of them are interlinked, are what would kind of be top of mind for myself.
Thank you very much. Thomas.
Well, I think the biggest challenge we have right now is a classic one from the world of finance. It's about bridging information gaps. So as I mentioned before, we're moving into the part where a big chunk of investment is going to be done by companies that, to start with, do not have strong credentials. It might be a steel company. We have some in Scandinavia that emit a lot of CO2 today, but will require a lot of capital to produce CO2-free steel 10 years down the road. The big problem I see is, how do you actually bridge the gap between the investors that only see the numbers today and the need to invest in something that would be seen 10 or 15 years down the road? This is the biggest challenge, I think, in all of sustainable finance, because I've yet to meet a single company that didn't say it would be carbon-free by 2050. And I have a pretty strong feeling that not all of those companies actually are going to make it, and maybe some of them don't even have a plan. So if we start allocating capital into the more dirty parts of the transition story, then we need instruments and tools to help guide us to say the capital goes to companies that have a credible long-term plan and can convince you about that. That's our job in the world of sustainable finance, to innovate and find the tools that can create the credibility and only make sure that only the right companies actually get access to the capital. I think investors will start requiring that, and they need the capital, right? Because these are companies that today, well, they are, often not in a position of having too much capital to start with.
Thanks, Thomas, very much. Robin, over to you.
Well, I think I would probably want to emphasize Amalie's point about the speed of infrastructure investment that is required, the speed and the scale. It's unprecedented, and for that to be effective, we need to de-risk. We need to de-risk investments, and that will give confidence to investors across the globe. I hear it so often that we say there's not a lack of capital. They say there's a lack of investable projects, and so establishing what the investment community considers to be investable projects and bankable projects is crucial. That comes through partnerships, and there are solutions, within reach in terms of partnerships to come up with the right financial models, but also partnerships to help bridge those information gaps that Thomas mentioned. We can share our expertise across the investment community and the developer community, and that's absolutely crucial. And I think so really partnerships, information sharing, and transparent disclosure. Again, I think Shamila made that point about transparency. So I'm kind of echoing a lot of points I've heard, but if we can develop the right partnerships and de-risk investments, then I think the way we've scaled up investment in, say, wind and solar is a great example of how this can be applied through other areas of green infrastructure.
Great, thanks very much, Robin. Shamila, over to you.
Thanks, Christelle. So largely agree with all the points we made already: skills, the investability, the perception of risk, and the ability to blend finance, for example, to start de-risking projects and being able to attract the capital. And of course the transition elements, completely. How do we make that credible, right? While we've got an intermediate phase of sort of brown assets that still need to be financed on the route to green, what do we need to do there? I'm going to take a slightly different angle, but a related one. I think another big challenge that we are going to be facing is to get an international understanding of the transition elements in particular. So when we need to attract financing to an economy like South Africa, how do we have our story told in a manner that's credible, that financiers understand that, and particularly when it's international capital that we're hoping to attract. And so for me, that is the challenge. And it's the concepts of fair share and common but differentiated responsibility. How does that translate into the narrative of financing, and how do we ensure that we're set up in a way to receive that financing, and that our own trajectories are going to be credible in these frameworks that investors are applying and have taken due cognizance to local context and circumstances, particularly the just elements of the transition.
Thanks very much. So, I mean, pulling all of these things together, I think there are a diversity of challenges, but they also seem to some extent to concentrate in sort of three areas around the pipeline, the cost, and one of them, which I think I'm most interested in as well, relates to our next question, is what advice, if you could, would you be giving CFOs and CEOs of non-financial corporates around trying to stimulate this on the other side of the table when you have conversations with them? And maybe with that, we can sort of start back. Nigel, I mean, your perspectives on expectations, knowledge and awareness, skills. I mean, I imagine that also goes into that realm. Do you have any thoughts or things that you would want to say to operators out there?
Yes, so I think if, when I'm speaking to CFOs and CEOs, my view is always, obviously I'm coming from a financial institutions perspective, but, green and climate finance comes in many kind of shapes and forms and sizes. It's not a one size fits all. I think quite often a lot of corporates, when you talk about climate finance, assume it's got to be a green bond. So they assume it's going to be a green bond. They've heard a lot about green bonds. It's a known use of proceeds, and therefore they have to have specific green assets. Quite a lot of corporates, in fact, most corporates don't actually have the assets to actually issue a green bond. But I think what they need to understand is that there are essentially a menu of different products now for all different corporates, whether that might be a known use of proceeds, it might be green, it might be social, it might be sustainability linked, it might be within the supply chain, it might be short-term facilities. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. It's also not as complicated as people think. So, again, this goes back to that education element. It's trying to educate CFOs and CEOs that actually sustainable finance is actually not as complicated and as difficult as you might think. Often we will have conversations with clients and they will like, we don't think we're ready for this yet, give us a while, a few years, and then we'll come back to you on this. And I'm often, do it. And those that have taken the leap of faith, those that have gone and, we've done instruments with, within 2 months, they come back and say, this is absolutely amazing. I can't believe how well this worked. It was far better than I thought it would be. And generally come back and, want to do another sustainable finance instrument. So, it's not as complicated as people thinking, it's something that people should be looking at to help them and enable them on this kind of decarbonisation transition journey.
Great, thanks so much. Thomas, I'd love to hear your views also around this particular point on the transition and sort of first mover perspectives. And you're just on mute.
That. The problem is that first movers sometimes move too early. And I think the first key issue, you got to make up if you're a CEO or CFO, you look at your sector. So does the technology exist that will propel this journey into transition? You got to make sure that what you're investing in actually has a realistic chance of achieving the outcome. And there are some sectors out there where that technology currently does not exist. Well, the second point is if you want to start on the journey, and I think in many sectors you have opportunities, you can tap into a different kind of energy sourcing. You can already now start experimenting with electrification. The point of using sustainable finance here is not so much to gain cheap financing. It's about signaling to the investor community. This is going back to the credibility issue we talked about before. When you sign up to reporting everything, to creating transparency, to maybe even like committing to spending your money in a certain way, then the investor community will take notice. And I think that's really the biggest advantage of being a corporate issuer of this kind of stuff, that you are signing up to the program and providing the information that investors need to make up if they think you're credible. And just by signing up, you're already more credible. So start by figuring out if you're ready and your business or your sector is ready for transforming itself. But if it is, move fast and make sure everybody knows about it.
Thanks ever so much. Robin, I'm going to call on you quickly just to give us your highlights of where you think CFOs and CEOs should be going and thinking, what you would tell them.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the first thing is to say that please try not to solve all your problems yourself, because naturally you'll be constrained to what you've always done. That's human nature. Learn lessons from others, and again, it comes to the partnership point about leveraging the expertise that is out there in terms of how others have transitioned. But I'll focus on the word transition because I accept Thomas's point about if you move too early, you could fall over and fundamentally break the first rule of business, which is not make money anymore. But equally, if you're investing in the wrong areas, you're investing in something that maybe doesn't have a future. That's the essence of transition risk. And so again, needing to take advice, thinking openly and about what's possible, possibly even reframing the business entirely. All these things need to be considered to have a business that's going to survive fundamentally. So yeah, I think that's my final point, just touching on that transition risk.
Great, thanks ever so much. Shamila, you're, as you pointed out, operating in a sort of a connector space as well.
Yeah.
So this is also just as relevant. Please go ahead.
So yeah, for me, take a step back and look at the kind of overarching trends that we're seeing. There's no doubt that there's an imperative and we have to transition totally towards a more sustainable economy, sustainable development in its entirety. So the first piece would be to go to the CEOs. You need to consider what the relevance is of your business model and your business in its entirety. And you need to use the sustainability lens to start considering that. Once you're doing that and you know that you have to change that business model possibly, and sustainable development, particularly the green elements, affect, I think, every industry. I mean, we talk about climate change, for example, there's a non-diversifiable risk, right? So it affects everybody. Which are the elements that you need to change? Once you understand that and you're able to start transitioning, understanding that it's going to become about your social license to operate, and you do that transition, then you own your story. The next guy you need to talk to is your CFO, saying your CFO needs to understand these instruments because these instruments are his ally and they're an enabler for him. And so those two things come together where you've got a strategy that's fundamentally shifting, and then the finance coming in to be able to support that in a credible way. And the instruments themselves allow for a tagging that then becomes very attractive to investors. So hopefully a recipe for success in something.
Thanks, Shamila. Amelie, we've got just a minute left, so I won't be summarizing, but I've really enjoyed everybody's views and perspectives, and you've got the floor to give us your perspectives on CFO and CEO advice.
Yeah, I just want to come back to the point that was made earlier, I think by Nigel, that the importance of upskilling. We know that this is a journey. I think it was well put that the transition, needs to take place over time. It's essential to ensure that's a smooth transition and that brings, the opportunities are maximized during that transition. But none of that can really happen without the necessary skills in-house, as well as, bringing those externally in support as well. So I think, that's a real challenge now for CEOs and CFOs to attract and build and upskill the human capital that will be needed for this transition.
Thank you so very much. I'm going to take the opportunity here to just thank our panelists exceptionally for very many wise words and insights and energy as well around acknowledging the challenges. And that's such a sort of a consulty word, the things that we're going to have to deal with, the gristle we're going to have to chew, and understand what we want to do and how we're going to do it, but that we're on the way because we've started to articulate the issues and challenges, and they're starting to emanate solutions and options that are out there. I think the exciting thing that I hear from everything about the panel today as well is that we understand these issues, but as Nigel's also said, there are products that are there. There are instances and examples. There are peers to learn from, and there is an interest of innovation. And the capital is there with the filters and the considerations and the concerns around diligence that come with that. But the pipeline needs to be developed, and we all need to work towards actually closing up that infrastructure gap, that investment gap, that we need to actually evolve the economies that we're working into. So from there, I'm going to, again, thank everyone very much. We've had a really great day. And with that, I'll let our panelists close out and hand back to Liam.